Here are some key cultural and interpersonal communication factors that affect operations on multicultural crews. So you can think of your typical ISS crew. These things are all going to have an impact. Your language, your nonverbal communication styles. Okay, if you're talking to someone from a different culture, you can get confused about what they want you to do. If you're upside down from them and they're using different nonverbal communication. Task relationship. Our task and relationship-oriented behavior. Some people tend to be more task-focused, others more focused on relationships. Patience and tolerance, decision-making process. Here's an interesting case here with the American astronauts versus Russian cosmonauts. The American astronauts tend to make decisions, very individually, right? So small teams of people will make decisions, individuals will make decisions, whereas in the Russian Space Agency, things tend to be more collaborative. So if there was a problem to solve, say on the space station, and it was manned by the Russians, they would probably come together, all 6 of them at a time, and talk about the problem. Where with the American program, they might have 2 people try and fix a particular problem. So it's less collaborative approach and more individual approach. So that leads to problems where you have Americans and Russians flying at the same time. The Americans want to get together and just make decisions individually or make it with their other counterpart, and the Russians want to be there talking about the problem altogether. Okay? So that might make the Russians feel isolated, while the Americans aren't including us in decision-making processes, and it might make the Americans feel like, oh, the Russians don't want us to do anything on our own. So you can see how that can lead to some problems. Respect for other cultures, just like the Greek astronaut that I gave an example of. If you don't have respect for other cultures or training about how to deal with other cultures, if you didn't know that Greek people like to be very close, have no privacy, I mean, not have no privacy, but have a lesser standard of privacy than the Americans, and you were flying with them and you were an American astronaut, you might be very confused by that situation. Right? So you might have to have cultural training for American astronauts and Greek astronauts to make sure that they can respect each other and understand that when an American astronaut is leaving to go to his bunk, it's not to kind of shun the Greek astronaut, it's just that's the way that their culture deals with factors. Personal hygiene and cleanliness, gender roles and stereotypes, and gender roles of stereotypes have happened on the Russian space station. They had one woman on a 3-person crew with 2 Russian men, and after the 3rd day, the Russian men were giving stereotypes like telling the woman to go give her tasks like preparing the food, so falling into these typical gender stereotypes. Now that might have been from a couple of years ago, but it illustrates the point. Conflict management and resolution, if people have different styles, different cultures have different styles. Trust in other people, scheduling, time management, and sense of humor. So those are all things that affect multicultural crews. The last point on crews is just looking at an analog, which is the wintering over at Antarctica, and the incidence of psychological problems between naval personnel and civilian personnel. Okay? And you can see here that we look at insomnia. After the wintering over period, the naval personnel had a 28% increase in insomnia, whereas the civilians only had 4%. Depression, the naval personnel had a 15% increase, whereas the civilians only had a 2%. A 2% decrease. So they actually had less depression after being in Antarctica for 4 months during over. And hostility, almost a 40% increase in hostility among the naval personnel versus a 21% increase for the civilian personnel. So the reason why this happens is that it's kind of the boredom factor, right? The naval personnel, they're kind of there to do support jobs. They come into their job and they spend a lot of time just waiting around. But military personnel also tend to be very driven, right? They want to get tasks done. So you find yourself in a situation where you're a very task-oriented person, you want to get things done, but you're in Antarctica for 4 months and you don't have anything to do. So you get an increase in the boredom factor here, and you can't do tasks. The civilian personnel tend to be more researchers. Okay? Not to say that they're less task-driven, but it's less of a military culture like get things done, get things done, get things done, and more of a steady flow. Okay? If I have some time now, I can work on writing out my results from my scientific study. Okay? So what does this mean about for spaceflight? It means that if you're selecting a crew, and if you have military personnel who tend to be very task-focused, want to get things done, want to accomplish goals, don't give them a 6-month flight to Mars where they have absolutely nothing to do, or you're going to get a 39% increase in hostility, you're going to get depression, and you're going to get insomnia. So plan your trip so that people who are very task-oriented like that have things to do. Maybe use the model of the civilian personnel, writing up scientific papers while you're in flight, okay? Analyzing some of the results. And on the way back too, right? Having the astronauts involved in the process of analyzing the results while they're flying back, or doing looking at some rocks or something. Okay, now looking at some psychological countermeasures. This is the last part of the presentation. So we're going to look at the stages of countermeasure implementation. So when are we initiating psychological countermeasures in the process of doing a flight? How they monitor, some crew quarter countermeasures, some countermeasures that are on the ISS right now, and finally behavioral competencies for long-duration spaceflight. So here's the kind of a picture of the process where they do monitoring, or sorry, the psychological countermeasures. It starts off with basic screening and selection, okay, which leads to how you're going to put your crew together. So you want to optimize your crew for a bit of psychological compatibility, using that list of compatibility factors that I showed you earlier. Finally, crew member training, including cultural training for any different cultures you're going to get in flight, and also training the mission control. The mission control interacts with the crew. Okay? Mission control also has to work closely together with other mission control personnel to work to solve the problems that are on orbit. In flight, there's monitoring and support. So how do we monitor once people are in space? That's the next slide. And then also supporting them during the mission. And finally, support post-flight, which is the part that people will probably forget a lot about, but it's important to acknowledge that an astronaut returning to Earth is undergoing some different psychological phenomena. He's got to adapt to first to gravity and psychological phenomena involved in the performance of that. I'll give you an example. One thing that they tell the husbands and wives of astronauts when they get back to Earth is not to hand them the baby, right? First they get back, you want to say, here's your baby. Because what they do is they'll think, oh, that's a good baby, I'm done with this now, and they put it up in the air and they'll drop it, right? Because they're used to be able to put things in space and just holding them there and they'll stay there, right? So they're still readjusting, and that readjustment takes about 4 or 5 days to go through the point where you don't just leave stuff up in the air. Astronauts are also completely unable to drive cars when they get back. There's instances where they get back, try to drive, and they'll crash because they're just not used to the physics again. It takes time to re-customize to that. So here are some areas. I won't go through this too much here, but just some areas that are going to be monitored. Okay, cognitive performance. So how the crew is performing, and most of the stuff is going to be done through surveys, talking or doing diagnostics with flight psychiatrists. Okay. So workload and fatigue, measuring their fatigue by questionnaires, having work rest schedules, sleep questionnaires or logs, talking with the crew, talking with the flight surgeon, circadian rhythms by temperature, analyzing the work rest schedules, stress and psychological well-being, again by questionnaires, private medical and psychological conferences, so you might get on the radio and talk to a psychiatrist for a bit to report some of these issues. Interpersonal relationships and crew cohesion, questionnaires, private medical and physiological counseling, and also the analysis of videos from crew interaction. So the flight psychiatrist can actually watch the video of how you interact with someone on the station or on your space flight and say, hey, here's a sign that this person is getting stressed out. Maybe we'll schedule them some extra rest time. Or maybe we'll schedule them some extra time to talk to their family because we're picking up on instances where they're becoming stressed. And I mean, that might get a bit of resentment too from the crew, right? Having someone constantly looking over your shoulder, looking at the cameras, watching your face.